In the winter of 1944, a small rural town in the Appalachian foothills of Kentucky would become the center of a chilling investigation. The Davis family, isolated in their modest farmhouse, were well known in their community, though for reasons not many cared to investigate. Before we dive into the story, let's take a moment to understand the significance of the time and place. It was a period of deep social conservatism, where rural communities like the one in Kentucky were often isolated from the rest of the world. These towns were filled with people who lived by strict codes of silence and self-reliance, where family secrets were often buried in the walls of old homes, never to be spoken of again. And so, when the local sheriff was called to the Davis residence, there was no reason to suspect what lay hidden beneath the surface. This would soon prove to be a deadly oversight. Click the like button and subscribe to the channel for more true crime investigations as we delve deeper into this terrifying case. Now, let's continue with the story. The story first broke in the local newspaper, the Harlan Daily, which, in its brief and sterile report, mentioned only a family disturbance at the Davis residence. The article was as cold and unremarkable as the winter air that swept through the mountains. The sheriff's department had been called to the home to look into the circumstances surrounding the family's apparent dysfunction, but little information was provided. It was a story that, on the surface, seemed like nothing more than an unfortunate domestic incident. But the truth behind the Davis family's turmoil was far darker than anyone could have imagined. The Davis family was headed by Horace Davis, a man in his late 40s. A stern and domineering figure, Horace had a reputation in the town for being a hard-working but somewhat mysterious man. His wife, Margaret, a meek woman who kept to herself, rarely spoke to anyone outside their family circle. At first glance, their home appeared no different from the other dilapidated houses that dotted the isolated mountain range. However, the family's quiet, reclusive nature had always seemed peculiar to the townspeople. Neighbors occasionally whispered about the peculiar behavior of the daughters, but no one ever gave it much thought. After all, it was a different time, and many considered such matters private family business. But in the winter of 1944, things began to unravel. The sheriff's department had responded to the disturbance call that morning, only to find the scene was not as it appeared. Inside the home, they discovered that 4 of Horace's daughters were all heavily pregnant, each carrying a child fathered by an unknown man. The news spread quickly, though the initial investigation provided few answers. The daughters, each under the age of 20, refused to speak about the father of their children. Rumors swirled around the family's suspicious isolation and the strange behavior of the father. Neighbors recalled Horace's occasional temper outbursts and the way his daughters seemed to shy away from interaction with the outside world. Yet no one dared ask too many questions. It was at this point that the investigation shifted from a domestic dispute to something far darker. The authorities' initial attempts to piece together the facts were thwarted by the silence of the daughters, who seemed to be hiding a secret far more sinister than anyone could have imagined. What had happened behind those closed doors? And what twisted path had led this family down the road to such unimaginable horror? Horace Davis was born in the year 1895, at a time when the Appalachian Mountains were still rugged and untamed, much like the man himself. His family, the Davises, had lived in the hills for generations, their lives shaped by the unforgiving terrain and the isolation that the remote mountain community provided. Horace grew up under a strict, almost unyielding code of silence, where outsiders were met with suspicion and the law often had little reach. It was a world where family ties were paramount, and loyalty was measured by how little one spoke to the outside world. Growing up in this environment, Horace learned early on that power lay in control over his surroundings, his work, and most importantly, his family. The strict social structures of the time had kept people in their place, and Horace, with his domineering nature, fit perfectly into the mold of a rural patriarch. His reputation as a hard-working man of few words quickly spread throughout the community. He worked tirelessly on his farm, keeping to himself, yet always demanding respect from those who came into his orbit. Despite his well-known presence, Horace remained an enigma. His life outside the family was shrouded in mystery, and when local authorities looked into his background years later, they discovered that his name had appeared in various police records, though no charges had ever been filed. The records spoke of minor incidents, a few scuffles with neighbors, complaints about his unapproachable demeanor, and an occasional altercation with other men over land disputes. However, these incidents were always dismissed as part of the rough life that came with living in such a remote place. There were no serious charges, no arrests, no convictions, just a trail of minor infractions that painted the picture of a man who, while difficult to engage with, had somehow avoided crossing the line into more severe criminal behavior. This silence, both from Horace and the surrounding community, would later prove to be one of the most damaging aspects of the investigation. In rural Appalachia, the word of a man like Horace carried weight. The idea of challenging him, or even speaking openly about his personal life, was taboo. And so, the suspicions that lingered around the Davis family went unchecked, dismissed, by a community that would rather avoid confrontation than uncover the truth. Horace's relationship with his wife, Margaret, was one of quiet submission. Margaret was a quiet, frail woman who often appeared to shrink into the background, her voice rarely heard even within her own home. She never left the house unless it was absolutely necessary, and when she did, it was with her husband at her side. The couple had 4 daughters, each born in rapid succession. The girls grew up under Horace's strict eye, isolated from the world outside, with only their father's cold, unyielding presence to shape their understanding of life. Margaret never questioned Horace's authority. It was clear that she had resigned herself to the life she had been given, keeping to herself and avoiding the attention of outsiders. But as the years passed, the isolation that had once been a shield for the family began to take a darker turn. It was not just the mountains that kept them secluded. It was Horace's increasing control over every aspect of their lives, a control that was not just physical but emotional as well. As the community watched the Davis family from a distance, few could have predicted what would eventually unfold behind closed doors. In the archives, the whispers of Horace's past remain just that, whispers. There was no definitive evidence to tie him to anything more sinister than petty quarrels, but as the investigation into the lives of his daughters continued, those whispers would soon grow louder. The truth, buried beneath years of silence and fear, was about to be uncovered. The deeper the investigators dug, the more Horace's shadow seemed to stretch over every corner of the case. There was no evidence, nothing that could be pointed to directly, yet everything about Horace screamed of a man whose secrets were far darker than any of his neighbors could have imagined. The past was beginning to come into focus, and with it came the horrifying realization that this family's silence had hidden something far worse than anyone had suspected. In the summer of 1943, a hidden journal entry was discovered buried within the dusty corners of an old wooden chest that had belonged to the Davis family. The chest, kept locked for decades, had been passed down through generations, its contents largely forgotten by the time investigators stumbled upon it in the late 1940s. Ellen, the second youngest daughter of Horace and Margaret, had written the entry just a year before the scandal would break in the small town. The journal was a simple leather-bound notebook, the pages yellowed with age and smudged with faint ink stains. At first glance, it seemed like the ramblings of a young girl, but the words within it spoke of something far darker. Ellen's entry was written in a cryptic coded language, a strange combination of symbols and words that appeared nonsensical. Yet, to those who knew how to read between the lines, the meaning was unmistakable. The text described a series of events, alluded to in vague and fragmented phrases, things that should not have been happening behind the walls of a family home. Ellen's entry spoke of hiding in the dark, of quiet whispers that haunted the nights. She wrote about the touch of someone she loved, a cold hand that she feared, and the promises made that would never be kept, yet no name was explicitly given. The words were deliberate in their ambiguity, but it was clear that Ellen, at the tender age of 16, had witnessed something that no child should have. The unsettling tone of her writing raised more questions than answers, leaving investigators with an unbearable sense of unease. The entry was vague, and the coded language was enough to frustrate the investigators. But it also opened a door. Something had happened to the Davis daughters, and it was becoming more clear that the family's carefully maintained silence had been hiding something far more sinister than anyone could have imagined. This was no mere family dispute. It was a systematic effort to conceal the truth, one that had been built over years of fear and manipulation. The investigators, now armed with this cryptic entry, turned their focus on the daughters. They had already spoken to the eldest daughter, Marie, whose testimony had been fragmented and contradictory. At first, Marie had insisted that everything was fine in their home, that there were no secrets, and that her father was simply misunderstood. But under further questioning, she began to unravel, her statements inconsistent and her demeanor increasingly anxious. She mentioned seeing things she couldn't explain, vague mentions of hidden rooms and strange nights, but nothing concrete enough to confirm any suspicions. The other daughters were no different. They each had their own version of events, but none of their testimonies aligned. Some spoke of painful memories, but refused to go into detail. Others hinted at violence, their words heavy with fear but light on specifics. The inconsistencies in their accounts only deepened the mystery. The gaps in their stories created an atmosphere of suspicion that seemed to close in around them. What was clear, however, was that the Davis daughters were deeply entrenched in a world of isolation. They spoke of nothing but their home, their father, and their mother, as if their lives had been confined entirely to the four walls of that farmhouse. The local town, only a few miles away, seemed like a distant memory to them. Neighbors hadn't seen the girls for years. The once vibrant young women had faded into the background of their own lives, as though deliberately hidden from view. They were ghosts in their own community, isolated not just by geography, but by a life lived in secrecy and silence. The family's insular nature, their inability or unwillingness to interact with the world outside their home, became a key element of the world in Tane. Investigation. It was clear that this isolation had kept them from anyone's notice, protecting the dark truths that lurked within the walls of the Davis farmhouse. It was a theme that would become central to the investigation as more details emerged, slowly revealing a web of control and manipulation that extended far beyond mere physical boundaries. But Ellen's journal entry, though cryptic, was the first piece of concrete evidence that suggested a much darker truth. Whatever had happened in the Davis home, it had been hidden from the world for far too long. And the more the investigators uncovered, the more it became apparent that no one, not even the daughters themselves, had fully understood the horrors they had endured. Marie Davis, the eldest of the four daughters, had always been the most vocal of the family. Unlike her sisters, who remained quiet and reserved, Marie had long struggled to speak her truth. Over the years, she had made several attempts to share her experiences, but those attempts were often dismissed as the ramblings of a troubled mind. Now, as investigators began to piece together the family's tragic story, Marie became the key figure in unraveling the truth. Marie was 30 when the investigation into the Davis family began, and her appearance had changed dramatically since the last time anyone had seen her. Her once youthful face was now marked by the stress of years spent buried in a family secret too horrific to confront, yet she was still the most willing to talk. At first, her testimony seemed like a breakthrough, the first person to speak out, to acknowledge that something terrible had happened within the family. But as investigators dug deeper into her history, they began to question the reliability of her account. Her memories were fragmented, pieces of a puzzle that refused to fit together. At times, Marie's voice cracked as she spoke of her father, Horace. She described him in chilling terms, a man who ruled the house with fear, a figure who was both a protector and a tormentor. Her words were laced with pain, but the details remained vague. elusive, almost like she was trying to remember something, but couldn't quite grasp it. The investigators soon discovered something troubling in the records they pulled from local archives. Marie had been admitted to a mental health institution several years prior. The reason for her stay was never made clear, but the records indicated a sudden breakdown, triggered by what appeared to be an emotional crisis. Her doctors had noted severe anxiety, delusional thoughts, and a complete withdrawal from reality. Marie's time in the institution had been marked by long stretches of silence and confusion, and the doctors could never pinpoint the exact cause of her breakdown. It was suggested that Marie had been under immense emotional strain for years, but what exactly had caused it remained a mystery. The mention of her mental health history cast doubt on the credibility of her testimony. Was Marie's version of events the result of deep trauma, her mind trying to protect her from something too horrific to comprehend? Or was she telling the truth, and the pain she endured was so profound that it had shattered her ability to communicate it fully? Investigators, who had initially thought they might have their first reliable witness, were now left grappling with this new uncertainty. But despite the questions surrounding Marie's mental stability, her words hinted at something far darker. She spoke of her father's growing rage and of a sense of dread that hung over the house, a feeling that no one could escape. She described a growing sense of isolation, a retreat into their home that seemed to intensify with each passing year. The family had once been part of the tight-knit rural community, but Horace's increasing paranoia had driven them further into seclusion. The more Marie spoke, the more the investigators realized that this was no simple, domestic issue. It was something far more sinister. Her recollections of the past were punctuated by moments of unsettling clarity. At times, she would pause mid-sentence, her eyes distant, as though trying to recall a memory that refused to come into focus. Her accounts of certain events were too fragmented, and as she wove in and out of the narrative, the investigators were left wondering whether she was protecting herself from the truth, or whether the horror she had lived through was simply too overwhelming to fully remember. One of the most chilling moments came when Marie described a specific event that had happened when she was just a child. She recalled hearing her younger sisters crying out from behind a closed door in the middle of the night. When she went to check on them, she found the door locked and her father's voice coming from within. He was speaking in a low, controlled tone, but the sound of it sent a wave of terror through Marie. She never told anyone about it. The next day, everything seemed normal again, but that memory haunted her, and the fear it caused never left. The investigators, while sympathetic to her trauma, realized that Marie's testimony was the first undeniable sign that something far darker was at play in the Davis household. The family's dysfunction wasn't just the result of poverty, isolation, or poor decisions. It was a deep, abiding evil that had poisoned the very core of their existence. Marie's testimony was the opening of a door, but it was a door that led into a labyrinth of confusion, terror, and shattered memories. As the investigators pressed her for more information, they could see the toll it took on her. Each question seemed to pull at the delicate threads of her sanity, as if dredging up old wounds that she wasn't ready to face. Yet, despite the gaps in her story, the sense of dread in her voice, the unease that emanated from her every word, could not be ignored. Something horrific had happened, that house. And now, the world was about to find out what it was. The investigation into the Davis family began to take an increasingly disturbing turn as the focus shifted from the vague testimonies of the daughters to hard evidence that could no longer be ignored. The breakthrough came when investigators, in their methodical search for any piece of concrete evidence, turned their attention to the birth records. What they uncovered was far more chilling than anyone had anticipated. Each of Horace Davis's 4 daughters, Marie, Ellen, and the 2 younger girls, was pregnant at the time of the inquiry. The shock came not from the fact of the pregnancies themselves, but from the sheer mystery of their origins. The birth records listed no fathers for the children. The names of the supposed fathers were either left blank or marked with the term unknown. It was an unnerving discovery, one that immediately suggested a horrific, hidden truth behind the closed doors of the Davis household. The investigators were left with more questions than answers. How could all 4 daughters be pregnant by unknown fathers? And why had no one in the community, not even the local authorities, ever raised any suspicion? As the investigators delved deeper into the family's history, they turned to records from the local church, the only institution that had any contact with the Davis family aside from the occasional visit to the doctor. The church's parish records, long since archived, revealed a history of neglect that had gone unnoticed for years. Margaret, the mother, had only attended church on rare occasions, and when she did, she never brought her daughters with her. There were no signs of any family involvement in community activities, and the girls were rarely seen outside of their home. The church's records mention no baptisms or other rites of passage for the Davis children, marking them as outsiders even in their own community. The local social services department, too, had made several attempts to check on the welfare of the Davis family, though these visits were often short and inconclusive. The daughters were described as shy and withdrawn, but there were no official complaints about their condition. The lack of intervention was a reflection of the time during this period. Rural families were often left to their own devices, and there was little awareness of the need to protect children from abuse in isolated areas. But as the investigators continued their search, they discovered that there had been complaints against Horace Davis long before the inquiry began. Documents from the sheriff's office revealed a decades-long series of reports filed by concerned neighbors, but each one had been quietly dismissed. There were accounts of Horace's erratic behavior, his frequent violent outbursts, and his increasingly authoritarian control over his daughters. Yet, despite the numerous reports, no formal action had been taken. The sheriff's office records, although fragmentary, pointed to a troubling pattern of negligence from local authorities, who either failed to investigate or were perhaps too intimidated to confront Horace. The lack of intervention, combined with the ever-growing evidence of abuse, painted a devastating picture. The investigation into the Davis family's life was unfolding like a slowly unwinding nightmare, with each discovery leading to more horrifying truths. The daughters had been kept isolated in a world of terror for years, their pregnancies only the outward signs of a much deeper, more insidious horror. The authorities had failed them, and now, decades of abuse were finally being uncovered. Despite the mounting evidence, the community remained largely unaware of the full extent of the Davis family's suffering. Horace Davis had held his grip on the family, and the town's silence, whether out of fear or indifference, had allowed the darkness to thrive unchecked. The investigation was beginning to piece together the fragments of a decades-long tragedy, one that had been hidden in plain sight, masked by the family's isolation and the community's willingness to look away. But now, the truth was starting to come to light. The investigation into the births, the records, and the complaints was only the beginning. Each new piece of evidence was a reminder that the horrors of the Davis family had been lurking in the shadows for far longer than anyone had realized. As the investigation into the Davis family continued, the pieces of the puzzle began to come together in unsettling ways. The police reports, which had long been buried in local archives, slowly revealed a trail of disturbing incidents that should have raised alarm years earlier. However, the deeper the investigators dug, the clearer it became that local law enforcement, whether complicit or simply ineffective, had failed to act on numerous occasions. Horace Davis's criminal history, though never fully explored, began to surface through a collection of police reports that had been filed over the years. The first of these reports dated back to the mid-1910 seconds, shortly after Horace returned from a brief stint working in the mining towns of West Virginia. These early reports spoke of multiple violent altercations disputes with neighbors, some over land, others over trivial matters, all escalating into physical confrontations. Though many of these incidents were brushed aside as nothing more than the unruly behavior of a man who was struggling to adjust after returning from years of isolation, they painted a picture of a man not entirely above suspicion. The reports that followed were more troubling. By the late 1922, Horace's name began to appear more frequently in connection with public disturbances, accusations of verbal and physical abuse, and even allegations of more disturbing crimes. Yet, despite these incidents being recorded by the local police, no charges were ever brought against him. Investigators found that many of the officers involved in these reports were either related to Horace by distant family ties, or were part of a network of individuals who preferred to maintain the status quo rather than challenge the Braston long-standing power of the Davis family in the community. There was no attempt to investigate these claims beyond the bare minimum, and each time, Horace was allowed to go free. In the early 30s, a particularly chilling report was uncovered. It came from a woman, a neighbor, who had been concerned for the welfare of the Davis daughters. She had made a formal complaint to the local sheriff after hearing strange noises late at night from the Davis home, including what sounded like desperate cries and pleading. The report was filed, but nothing came of it. No investigation, no follow-up. The woman, terrified of reprisal, eventually withdrew her statement, leaving the authorities with no reason to pursue the matter further. The sheriff's office, which should have acted, chose instead to ignore the complaint, perhaps due to the Davis family's prominent position in the small town. It became clear, as the investigators sifted through these documents, that a dangerous pattern had emerged over the years. Every complaint, every report of strange or troubling behavior had been dismissed or quietly shelved. Horace Davis, it seemed, was untouchable, his status and power in the community shielding him from the very law meant to protect his daughters. His reputation as a hard-working, quiet man, coupled with the family's isolation, kept suspicions at bay for decades. As the story shifted between past and present, the investigators began to realize the true horror of what had transpired. They had initially believed that the disturbing facts about the Davis family were confined to the present moment, the pregnancies, the hidden journal, the cryptic statements from Marie. But as they pieced together the timeline of events, they understood that the abuse had been happening for far longer than they had thought, stretching back to a time when Horace was a younger man, just beginning to assert his dominance over his family. The more the investigators uncovered, the more the scope of the crimes expanded. What had seemed like isolated incidents of domestic dysfunction slowly revealed itself as a systematic pattern of abuse that had persisted across generations. The girls had been born into a world of terror, and they had never known anything different. Their lives, from the very beginning, had been shaped by Horace's violent grip on the family, his twisted control over their every move. As the investigation continued, the investigators began to piece together an even more disturbing truth. The isolation that had protected the family for so long had not only shielded them from the scrutiny of the outside world, but it had also allowed Horace to build his own dark kingdom, where the laws of the land did not apply. It was a place where silence reigned, and where the truth, hidden behind layers of secrecy, could not be heard. The horrific details of the Davis family's life had been buried beneath years of neglect, fear, and isolation, but now they were starting to surface. The investigators knew that they had only just begun to scratch the surface of the horror that had been perpetrated within the walls of that farmhouse. As they turned the pages of the old reports and examined the pieces of evidence that had been carefully hidden away for so long, they could not help but wonder how many other families, in similar situations, had suffered in silence, how many others had been trapped in their own personal hell with no one to hear their cries. This was not just a case of domestic abuse. It was the unraveling of a dark legacy, one that had been built on generations of fear, manipulation, and violence. And with each new revelation, the investigators were left to grapple with the chilling realization that the true horror of the Davis family's story was only just beginning to unfold. As the investigation deepened, the investigators uncovered a series of journal entries from 1944 that cast a new light on the Davis family's long history of secrecy. These journals, kept by various members of the local community, offered a retrospective analysis of events that, when viewed through the lens of time, revealed a pattern of deliberate avoidance and denial. It became evident that Horace Davis had managed to fly under the radar of local law enforcement for decades, aided by both the community's reluctance to question him and the law's inability to act on the mounting evidence of his abusive behavior. The journal entries, some dating back to the early 30s, painted a picture of a man who was, by all accounts, seen as a pillar of the community. Horace's reputation as a hard worker, a self-reliant farmer who kept to himself, had shielded him from scrutiny. In rural southern communities like the one the Davis family lived in, where everyone knew everyone's business, it was difficult to remain anonymous, but Horace had done it for years. His quiet, controlling presence seemed to carry an unspoken authority that others feared to challenge. Neighbors spoke highly of him, admiring his ability to thrive in the harsh environment of the mountains. His children, though they rarely ventured out of the house, were largely ignored by the outside world, their lives considered too private for intervention. But now, in the wake of the investigation, these journal entries painted a different picture. They revealed how Horace's behavior, which was often seen as eccentric or even unsettling, had been brushed aside by both the local community and the law. One entry from a neighbor described how, during a visit to the Davis household, she had noticed the strange, almost fearful way in which the daughters interacted with their father. She had overheard whispered conversations between them, their voices trembling with fear whenever Horace's name was mentioned. But when she tried to speak to the sheriff about her concerns, she was told that the family was simply private and kept to themselves. No one had thought to question the underlying cause of that fear. It was a reflection of the cultural context in which the Davis family existed, an isolated rural community where silence was often the preferred response to uncomfortable truths. In the South, particularly in the early to mid-20th century, there were deeply ingrained social norms that made it difficult for people to speak out against authority figures, especially men like Horace, who were seen as hard-working and self-sufficient. The societal structures of the time dictated that family matters remained within the household, and any disturbance to that order was seen as taboo. It was not just that people did not know, it was that they did not want to know. The cultural inability to address such taboo subjects in the public sphere allowed for the perpetuation of abuse behind closed doors, where it remained unchecked for far too long. The local law enforcement, for its part, had been equally negligent. In those years, rural communities were often underfunded and underdeveloped in terms of law enforcement. The sheriff's office, staffed by a few officers who were more concerned with petty thefts and land disputes than with investigating more complex crimes, had no training or resources to address cases of family violence. And so, when complaints began to surface about the Davis family, they were either ignored or dismissed as unimportant. When the first reports of abuse came in during the 30s, officers simply wrote them off as domestic squabbles, not worth their time. The law was ill-equipped to deal with the complexity of the situation, and no one within the system seemed willing to take action. Horace's name appeared time and time again in the records, but there was never a serious investigation. Instead, the authorities chose to let the family live in isolation, assuming that the quiet, reclusive life they led was simply part of the Southern way of life. The law's failure to act was compounded by the community's reluctance to speak up. Neighbors feared Horace's wrath, and the thought of challenging his authority was unthinkable. The pattern of denial and avoidance continued for years, ensuring that the horror behind the closed doors of the Davis home remained a well-guarded secret. As the investigators pored over the historical records, the full scope of the denial became apparent. The journals, combined with testimony from witnesses who were finally able to break their silence, revealed a chilling reality. Horace had, for years, manipulated the system to his advantage, and the law had failed to protect his daughters. The evidence of abuse was there, hidden in plain sight, but it was ignored or swept under the rug time and time again. The cultural and legal frameworks of the time had allowed for this atrocity to continue unchecked, and now, in the wake of the investigation, the full weight of the community's failure was becoming clear. This wasn't just a failure of the law, it was a failure of the entire system, from the authorities to the neighbors, who had allowed Horace's control to go unchallenged. The shame of it all lay not just in the abuse, but in the collective silence that allowed it to persist for so long. The investigation into the Davis family had, until now, been dominated by distant recollections, fragmented testimony, and cryptic evidence. But it was in the personal letters of the daughters, discovered in a box of old belongings hidden away in the attic of the Davis home, that a clearer, more haunting picture began to emerge. These letters, written by the daughters over the years, offered an unfiltered glimpse into their tortured souls, revealing the depth of their suffering, fear, and the complex, twisted loyalty they felt toward their father. The letters were written in different hands, each one expressing the emotions of the daughter who penned it, Marie, Ellen, and the two younger girls. They were addressed to no one in particular, sometimes scribbled hastily, other times carefully penned, as if they were meant to be read, but by whom they never knew. Some of the letters were written in a tone of desperate plea, while others seemed like quiet acceptance, as if they had long given up on ever being saved from the prison their father had created. Marie's letter was the first to be uncovered. It was dated several years before the investigation had begun, a letter she had written when she was still a young woman in her 20s. The words, scrawled hastily on the paper, were a tortured cry for help, but they were hidden behind a veil of fear and shame. She spoke of the deep emotional pain of living under her father's oppressive rule, a feeling torn between her loyalty to her family and her desire to escape. Yet, as the letter unfolded, it became clear that Marie was still bound by an unspoken sense of duty to her father, a duty that had been drilled into her since childhood. "I am so sorry, Father. I wish I could be a better daughter," the letter began, each word a quiet admission of guilt. "I don't know what I have done to deserve this, but I know you love us, even if I don't understand it. I feel so lost, like I am breaking inside. I don't want to betray you, but sometimes I wonder if the rest of the world would see us differently if we could just leave. But where would we go? I can't go anywhere without you." The tone was riddled with conflicting emotions, love, fear, and a deep sense of betrayal that Marie couldn't voice. As investigators read on, they understood the complexity of Marie's emotions. She had been manipulated and controlled for so long that even in the face of her suffering, she still sought her father's approval. Her words weren't just an expression of pain, they were a reflection of the deep, insidious bond that Horace had created, where love and terror had become indistinguishable. Ellen's letter, found shortly afterward, was no less heartbreaking. It was quieter, more subdued, but there was an unmistakable tone of desperation in her writing. Unlike Marie, Ellen had never openly rebelled against their father, and her letter revealed the depth of her silent submission. She spoke of the torment that had shaped her view of the world, a world where every step she took was dictated by fear. Yet there was also a sense of resignation in her words. She no longer expected any salvation. She had come to believe that her fate was sealed, that the world outside the walls of the Davis farmhouse would never be hers to experience. "I don't know why I am writing this, maybe to say goodbye, or to ask for forgiveness, even though I know I don't deserve it. I have lived a life of fear, and I don't know if I'll ever get out of it. But I don't blame anyone but myself. I wish I could be stronger, but every day feels like I'm sinking further and further. Father tells me everything is fine, and that I should be grateful for what we have. But what do we have? I don't even know anymore. All I want is peace, but it seems that peace is something I'll never have." The younger daughter's letters, though less articulate, conveyed similar sentiments of fear and confusion. They spoke of feeling trapped in a nightmare they couldn't escape, torn between the loyalty to their father and an instinctual desire to break free. They had been raised in an environment that blurred the lines between love and control, and their ability to trust anyone outside the family had been shattered by years of manipulation. As the investigators pored over these letters, they began to understand the full extent of the emotional manipulation that had occurred within the Davis household. Horace had not only controlled his daughters physically, but he had also controlled their minds. The emotional abuse they had suffered was far more subtle than physical violence, but it was no less damaging. The letters revealed a constant battle between the daughters' fear of their father and their desire to protect him, a loyalty that had been instilled in them from birth. They had been made to feel that their father was the only person who truly cared for them, and they were bound to him in ways they couldn't even begin to comprehend. In the midst of this emotional turmoil, the investigators began to see how the daughters had become complicit, not by choice, but out of fear and manipulation. Some of them had come to believe that their suffering was a necessary part of maintaining the family's facade of normalcy. They had been taught to keep quiet, to never speak out, and to hide the truth, no matter how much it tore them apart. The investigations into the family's history revealed that these daughters, despite their inner turmoil, had kept their father's secret for years, each one of them trapped in a cycle of denial and self-loathing. Their testimonies, once fragmented and contradictory, began to slowly align with the new evidence that had come to light. As the investigators continued to piece together the truth, they realized that these girls, now women, were victims in a far more complex way than they had originally understood. They had been born into a world where their father's control was absolute, and the voices of these daughters, once silenced by fear, were now telling the world the truth they had long buried. The investigation, which had been slowly unraveling the dark secrets of the Davis family, reached its tragic culmination with the discovery of one final piece of evidence, a letter written by Margaret Davis, the mother of the 4 daughters, and found long after her death. Margaret, who had been largely silent throughout the investigation, had left behind this letter in the 1,950 seconds just before her death, sealed away in a small envelope and hidden beneath the floorboards of the family home. The letter was discovered by the investigators during one of their final searches of the property. It had been a long-forgotten relic, lost to the passage of time, but its discovery would prove to be the most crucial revelation in the entire case. The letter was addressed to no one in particular, though it was clear that Margaret had written it in a desperate attempt to unburden herself. Her words, though shaky and faint with age, provided the final piece of the puzzle that tied together all the fragments of evidence. "I have stayed silent for too long," the letter began, and immediately it was clear that this was no ordinary letter. It was a confession, one that Margaret had kept hidden for decades, perhaps out of fear, perhaps out of guilt. The words spilled from the page, telling a story of a woman trapped in a life she could not escape. "Horace has done terrible things to our daughters," Margaret wrote, her words trembling with a kind of sorrowful acceptance. "I have known it for years, and I have been too afraid to say anything. I am afraid that he will hurt me, or worse, but I cannot live with this guilt anymore. He has not only hurt them, he has destroyed them. He has made them into prisoners in their own home, and I have been too weak to stop him. I should have left him long ago, but I stayed. I stayed because I thought it was the only way to protect them. I was wrong. I failed them." As investigators read through Margaret's letter, the weight of her words hit them with suffocating force. It was clear now that Horace had not simply abused his daughters, he had enslaved them, controlling every aspect of their lives in ways that went far beyond physical abuse. Margaret's letter revealed that Horace had trapped his daughters in a cycle of emotional and psychological manipulation so intense that they had come to believe they had no other choice but to endure his torment. Margaret spoke of the isolation, the secrecy, and the fear that had dominated their lives. She described how Horace had systematically broken their spirits, making them believe that they could never leave, that the world outside their home was dangerous and hostile. He had convinced them that they were incapable of surviving on their own, and that their only worth came from their obedience to him. The horror of this realization was not just in the abuse, it was in the complete psychological imprisonment he had imposed on them. Margaret's words were accompanied by her own feelings of guilt and regret. She admitted to having known about the abuse, but she had stayed silent, believing that doing so would protect her daughters from Horace's wrath. She wrote of the moments when she tried to intervene, only to be silenced by her husband's violent outbursts. "I tried to protect them when I could," she confessed, "but he always found a way to make me believe that I was the one who was wrong. And in the end, I was the one who let them down." The final discovery of Margaret's letter marked a devastating turning point in the investigation. It was no longer just about the abuse of 4 daughters. It was about a family bound by fear, isolation, and manipulation for generations. Horace had effectively enslaved his daughters, not just through physical violence, but through the systematic destruction of their sense of self-worth and autonomy. The horror of what had happened inside that house was far greater than anyone had anticipated. The full scope of Horace's terror was unveiled quietly but devastatingly. For years, he had managed to keep the outside world at bay, controlling not only his family but also the narrative that had surrounded them. He had created an environment where the daughters were entirely dependent on him, incapable of seeing any way out. And even when the outside world began to notice, when neighbors whispered and the law was finally brought in, Horace's control over his family remained absolute. The investigation into the Davis family was now complete. The pieces had all come together. The cryptic journal entries, the scattered letters, the historical records, the testimony of the daughters, each piece revealed a deeper layer of horror than anyone had imagined. And yet, despite the horrors that had been uncovered, there was a lingering question. How had such a nightmare been allowed to persist for so long? The investigators now knew the full extent of the abuse, but they were also left with the haunting realization that, in many ways, the system had failed the Davis family. The silence of the community, the reluctance of the authorities to intervene, and the deep cultural and legal isolation that had protected Horace for decades. All of these factors had played a role in allowing the abuse to continue unchecked. As the investigation concluded, there was no sense of closure, no finality. The damage done to the Davis family could never be undone. The legacy of Horace's reign of terror would live on in the lives of the daughters, in the community's failure to act, and in the devastating truth that had been uncovered too late. The investigation into the Davis family came to a close with a sense of quiet resolution, though the damage done could never truly be undone. Horace Davis, though long deceased by the time the full scope of his atrocities was revealed, had left behind a legacy of horror and suffering that had scarred his daughters for life. The case, which had begun as a quiet inquiry into a family disturbance, had uncovered not just the details of physical abuse, but a far darker reality, one of psychological manipulation, isolation, and systematic control. In the aftermath of the investigation, the world began to reckon with the full weight of the tragedy. While justice was finally meted out, it came too late to restore what had been lost. The criminal charges against Horace's surviving family members, including the possible involvement of some of his daughters in perpetuating the secrecy, were ultimately dropped, given the overwhelming evidence of the trauma they had suffered. But the investigation did not end without consequence. The ripple effects of the revelations spread far beyond the confines of the Davis family, exposing deep flaws in the legal system, in the community's blind obedience to family authority, and in society's unwillingness to address uncomfortable truths. The investigators, who had painstakingly pieced together the truth over many long months, were left to reflect on the horror they had uncovered. They understood, perhaps more than anyone else, the damage that silence could do. The Davis family's story was a tragic testament to the way that power and fear can be wielded to control not just bodies, but minds. It was a story of generational trauma, where the wounds of one generation had been passed down to the next, hidden beneath layers of denial, fear, and misplaced loyalty. As the final reports were filed, the investigation team sat together in silence, each person processing the enormity of what they had just uncovered. There was no sense of triumph, no sense of victory. Instead, there was only the quiet realization that, despite their efforts, the lives of the four daughters could never be fully restored. They would never have the childhood they deserved, never have the opportunity to live in a world free from fear and manipulation. The legacy of Horace Davis's reign of terror would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The case, though closed, left a lingering question. How many others had suffered in silence, trapped in the same cycle of abuse, concealed by the same veil of isolation and denial? How many families had endured horrors behind closed doors, their cries unheard, their pain unnoticed, simply because no one had been willing to challenge the status quo? As the investigation drew to a close, the team urged the community and society as a whole to learn from the past, to recognize that justice delayed is justice denied, and that the silence of the past should never be allowed to repeat itself. The Davis family's story was a stark reminder of the systemic failures that had allowed such an atrocity to go unnoticed for so long. But it was also a call to action, urging people to recognize the signs of abuse, to speak out against the abuse of power, and to challenge the cultural norms that allow such suffering to go unchallenged. The daughters of Horace Davis had, in many ways, been betrayed by everyone around them, by a system that failed to protect them, by a community that turned a blind eye, and by a father who had broken them in ways that no one could ever repair. Their suffering, though finally acknowledged, could never be fully compensated. The tragedy of their lives was one that would never be forgotten, but their story also served as a painful reminder of the work still to be done in our society, work that demands vigilance, empathy, and a willingness to confront the darkest corners of our shared history. As the final chapter in the investigation came to a close, the team, though somber and exhausted, knew one thing with certainty: the truth had been uncovered. The story, painful as it was, had been told. And now, it was up to society to ensure that such horrors would never again be allowed to fester in the shadows. If this story has touched you, make sure to click the like button and subscribe to the channel. Together, we can bring more hidden truths to light and ensure the voices of the silenced are heard.